the serial killer, once mailed letters to newspapers bragging about murder. He left coded messages, he taunted the police, and more than 50 years later, no one knows who he really was. He signed his letters with a strange symbol, a circle with a crosshair, and he called himself the Zodiac Killer. His first known victims were just two teenagers parked on a quiet road in California. But investigators would soon realize something terrifying. This killer didn't just want to murder, he wanted the world to watch. Who was the man behind the crosshair symbol? How did he commit multiple attacks, send letters to newspapers, and still disappear without a trace? For decades, detectives chased suspects. Cryptographers tried to decode his messages. Journalists followed every lead. But the identity of the Zodiac Killer remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in criminal history. To understand how the nightmare began, we have to go back to a quiet winter night in 1968, Northern California. The late 1960s. Cities like San Francisco were alive with music, protests, and cultural change. But just outside the city, small towns like Vallejo and Benicia felt peaceful. Teenagers went on late-night drives, couples parked along quiet country roads. It was the kind of place where people believed nothing truly terrible could happen. But somewhere in the darkness, someone was already watching. 17-year-old David Faraday was known as a quiet and thoughtful student. He loved science and electronics. Friends described him as polite and respectful. 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen was bright and outgoing. She loved poetry and spending time with friends. On December 20th, 1968, they went on what should have been a simple date. Neither of them knew it would become a tragic moment. In American criminal history, that evening David borrowed his mother's Rambler station wagon. He picked up Betty Lou and the two drove through the quiet countryside. Eventually they arrived at a gravel turnout along Lake Herman Road. It was a secluded place. Teenagers sometimes parked there to talk, listen to music, or watch the stars. But sometime after 11 p.m., another car entered the area. Investigators later believed the driver may have been watching the couple, waiting, studying the situation. Then around 11:15 p.m., the night turned violent. A second car pulled up behind David's vehicle. Its headlights illuminated the Rambler. At first, David may have thought it was a police officer or another couple arriving at the spot. But moments later, a man stepped out of the car holding a gun. Investigators believe David exited the vehicle. What happened next unfolded in seconds. A shot rang out. David Faraday collapsed. Betty Lou Jensen ran across the gravel road in panic. The attacker fired multiple shots. She fell only a short distance away. When police arrived later that night, the rural road was silent again. The killer had already disappeared. Two teenagers were dead, and investigators had almost no clues. Local authorities in Solano County began searching for answers. Shell casings were collected, witnesses were questioned, but the case quickly became difficult. There were no clear suspects, no witnesses to the attack, and no obvious motive. At first, investigators considered several possibilities: a jealous rival, a random act of violence, or a local criminal. But months passed without answers. Then, suddenly, the killer struck again. July 4th, 1969, fireworks filled the sky across Northern California. In Vallejo, two young adults parked in a quiet area of Blue Rock Springs Park. 19-year-old Darlene Farron sat in the driver's seat. Her friend Michael Maju sat beside her. Shortly after midnight, another vehicle entered the parking lot. The driver stepped out. Without warning, gunfire erupted. Bullets shattered the car windows. Both victims were struck. The attacker briefly walked away, then returned and fired again. Moments later, the car sped away into the darkness. But this time, the killer made a mistake. Michael Maju survived. About 40 minutes later, a phone rang inside the Vallejo Police Department. A calm male voice spoke to the dispatcher. He reported the shooting. Then he said something chilling. He claimed responsibility not only for the attack but also for the murders. Months earlier on Lake Kerman Road. The caller hung up. Police traced the call to a nearby payphone. It was located just blocks from the police station. Whoever made the call had been standing dangerously close to the officers searching for him. But the killer was about to reveal himself in a very different way. Because weeks later, letters began arriving at newspaper offices. Letters that would terrify an entire state and introduce the world to a new name, the Zodiac. By the summer of 1969, fear was slowly spreading. Across Northern California, 2 brutal shootings, 2 separate crime scenes, and now a mysterious caller claiming responsibility. But investigators still didn't know who they were hunting. Then, on September 27, 1969, the Zodiac Killer changed his method completely. This time, he wouldn't hide in the darkness with a gun. He would step directly into the daylight. And his next victims would see him face to face. Lake Berryessa. The afternoon sun shined brightly over Lake Berryessa. It was a peaceful weekend. Families relaxed along the shoreline. Boats drifted across the water. Nearby, 2 college students were enjoying the quiet scenery. 20-year-old Brian Hartnell as 22-year-old Cecilia Shepard sat on a blanket near the lake. They talked. They laughed. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then Cecilia noticed something strange. A man was approaching from the trees. At first, it looked like he might be hiking, but as he got closer, the couple realized something was terribly wrong. The man was wearing a black hood. The hood covered his entire head, and on the chest of his dark costume was a symbol, a circle with a crosshair. The same symbol that would later appear in Zodiac letters. The man held a gun, but his voice sounded calm, controlled. He told the couple he was an escaped prisoner. He claimed he needed money and their car to escape to Mexico. Trying to stay calm, Brian and Cecilia cooperated. The attacker ordered Brian to tie Cecilia with lengths of rope. Then the man tied Brian as well. But the story about escaping prison was only a lie. Moments later, the attacker pulled out a large knife. The peaceful afternoon suddenly turned into a nightmare. The man began stabbing both victims repeatedly. When the attack ended, he walked calmly back toward their car. But before leaving, the killer did something chilling. Using a felt-tip pen, he wrote a message on the car door. Dates, symbols, and references to earlier crimes. It was like a twisted signature, a message meant for investigators. The Zodiac Killer had struck again, but this time his victims were still alive. Despite severe injuries, Brian Hartnell survived the attack. He later described the attacker to police. A white male, heavy build, around 6 feet tall. The man spoke clearly and seemed strangely calm during the entire encounter. But Cecilia Shepard's injuries were far more serious. 2 days later, she died at the hospital. Another victim. Another unanswered question. Investigators now knew something terrifying. The Zodiac Killer wasn't following a predictable pattern. He could strike anywhere, at any time, and soon he would commit his most shocking crime yet. October 11th, 1969. Night fell over. San Francisco, taxi driver, Paul Stein, picked up a passenger in the downtown area. The destination was the quiet neighborhood of Presidio Heights. Nothing about the ride seemed unusual, but when the taxi stopped near the passenger's destination, the rider suddenly pulled out a gun. A single shot echoed inside the cab. Paul Stein collapsed over the steering wheel, but the killer didn't rush away. Instead, he calmly removed a piece of Stein's shirt. Then he wiped down parts of the taxi before stepping into the night. This time, however, someone had seen him. 3 teenagers watching from a nearby house noticed the scene and called police. Officers quickly began searching the area. One officer later believed he may have passed a man walking nearby who matched the suspect's description. However, because of an incorrect radio description of the suspect at the time, the officer did not stop him. Whether that man was the Zodiac killer remains unknown. Days later, another letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. Inside the envelope was a shocking piece of evidence, a fragment of Paul Stein's shirt, proof that the writer was the killer. The message mocked the police investigation. The writer claimed responsibility for the murder, and he continued using the chilling name he had chosen for himself, the Zodiac. Over the next months, more letters and cryptic messages appeared. Some contained complex ciphers, others included threats against the public. The killer seemed obsessed with attention. He wanted newspapers to print his messages. He wanted the public to feel afraid. And for a time, it worked. Over the years, investigators examined hundreds of possible suspects. One of the most discussed individuals was Arthur Lee Allen, a man from Vallejo. Allen attracted attention during the investigation and was questioned multiple times. However, despite years of scrutiny, no conclusive evidence ever proved he was the Zodiac killer. Fingerprints did not match. Handwriting comparisons were inconclusive, and later DNA testing did not provide a definitive connection. As time passed, the list of suspects continued to grow, but none could be proven beyond doubt. By the early 1970s, the letters from the Zodiac began to slow. Then they stopped. No confirmed murders. No new messages. It was as if the killer had simply disappeared. Investigators across California continued working the case. Thousands of leads were examined, but the identity of the Zodiac killer remained unknown. More than 50 years later, the Zodiac case remains officially unsolved. The killer once claimed responsibility for dozens of murders, but investigators have only confirmed a handful of victims. For the families involved, the mystery never truly ended. There was no arrest, no trial, no final answers. And somewhere in the shadows of history, the identity of the man behind the crosshair symbol may still remain hidden, waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps